Welcome to Trench Diaries. This is Another Place, Another Time, Chapter 4. Sunshine, Chianti and Ice Cream. What an exciting prospect lay ahead. An escape from icy East Prussia to warm and sunny Italy. An additional bonus was that my best friend, Fähnrich Otto Luft, who had been with me since the Marineschule at Flensburg, was also posted to the 29th U-boat flotilla. The two of us boarded a train at Pillau bound for the south, crossed the Alps and after a stopover in Bologna arrived at La Spezia on the Gulf of Genoa, one of Italy's largest naval bases, on April 1st of 1942. At La Spezia we found that a long pier on one side of the harbour with two adjacent buildings had been assigned to the 29th flotilla, which had been operating in the Mediterranean since the previous September. The larger building provided living quarters for the crews and the smaller one housed the flotilla administration and officers' mess. There were always two or more U-boats tied up at the pier, vessels that either had just returned from patrol or were preparing for one. Otto and I were somewhat surprised to find 8 Fähnriche zur See from our own crew 40 already at La Spezia, some of whom we knew, and they gave us hearty welcome. The flotilla command, however, did not consider our arrival such a momentous event, and although we were allowed to eat in the officers' mess, it was made very clear that we Fähnriche were still very insignificant members of the U-Boot-Waffe and had a long way to go before we achieved a status worth noting. After a few days, Otto and I received our assignments to Frontboote, Otto to U-74 and me to U-375, both Type 7C craft, as were all the U-boats in the Mediterranean. We were happy to become members of a crew. We now became very busy familiarizing ourselves with the intricacies of the machinery of Type 7C U-boats, as this vessel was new to us because most of our training had been done on the little Type 2 boats. Part of our instruction took place at the shipyard of the Regia Marina, or Italian Navy, across the harbor from the flotilla base where our U-boats were repaired. We observed the work being done on several boats, but our attempts to communicate with the yard workers were frustrated by our lack of Italian, although we were surprised to discover what extent some of the German U-boat personnel had become proficient in that language. We learned some words very quickly, particularly domani, or tomorrow, which seemed to be the routine response to any question about when a job would be finished. We came to know that this word actually meant dopodomani, in a few days, or the day after tomorrow, and that it also could be translated as probably never. In our free time we explored La Spezia and some of the surrounding mountains, although I do not recall anything memorable about the nightlife in this port. To emphasize the friendly relationship that was supposed to exist between Germany and Italy, we were not permitted to wear our ceremonial dirks off the base when in dress uniform. On the base, meals in the officers' mess were usually very formal affairs, served by Italian waiters wearing white gloves, with their thumbs often showing traces of the soup of the day. One local custom that did take some getting used to was the serving of red wine throughout the day, as much as water would be in North America. The Mediterranean was not a good place for U-boats. Beginning in September of 1941, our submarines had been sent into the theater at the express order of Hitler to assist our forces fighting in North Africa, much against Dönitz's wishes as he wished to concentrate on the North Atlantic. Altogether, 64 U-boats operated in the Mediterranean during the war, and all of them became casualties. For the U-Boot-Waffe, the Mediterranean quickly developed reputation as an extremely dangerous body of water. It had the disadvantage of being small in area compared to the Atlantic. There was little room to plan attacks and little time to carry them out. Land-based Allied aircraft could cover almost the entire area of that sea, and this, only too often, had unpleasant consequences for our boats. Some felt that the danger in the Mediterranean was partly due to the water, which was much clearer than in the Atlantic. But we also thought another explanation might be the fact that, from our impression, half of the bombs dropped on us came from German aircraft. There was absolutely no cooperation of any kind between the Kriegsmarine and the Luftwaffe in the Mediterranean, and our aircraft were never informed about the locations of the U-boats. I do not claim that any U-boat submarine was actually sunk by German aircraft, but I am trying to convey our skeptical and sarcastic attitude towards the other German fighting services. And I can honestly say that in the U-Boot-Waffe we always felt a much closer affinity to the Allied navies than we did to our own Luftwaffe or army. Our three services differed so much in their attitudes that they were often referred to as the Republican Army, the Nazi Air Force and the Imperial Navy, and we sailors did not at all mind being called Imperial. Cooperation with the Regia Marina, the Italian Navy, was not much better. One of our U-boats was rammed and sunk by an Italian destroyer at the entrance to Salamis harbor in Greece, our other submarine base in the Mediterranean. In the last week of April of 1942, the crew of Otto's boat U-74, commanded by Oberleutnant zur See Karl Friedrich, began loading torpedoes and provisions in preparation for its next mission. After being fully armed and stored, U-74 went out for a lengthy stationary test dive inside the harbor, which Otto Luft was ordered by his CO to photograph and which I include in this book, and then Otto bid me goodbye and I wished him a safe return. U-74 departed from La Spezia at the end of April, and a few days later my boat, U-375, began its own patrol. My commanding officer on U-375 was Kapitänleutnant Jürgen Könenkamp, a tall, lanky and somewhat aloof individual. My position on board was supernumerary at the level of a leading seaman, and I reported to the Leitender Ingenieur, or LE, not to the Wachoffiziere or watch officers, who were responsible for all the non-mechanical functions of the boat. I was on U-375 to master all the technical details of the propulsion and other mechanical systems of the Type 7, and also to gain experience in maintenance, diving, damage control and surfacing, without actually having to assume any responsibility for these functions. My accommodation was not in the wardroom or officers' quarters, but in the Unteroffizierraum or petty officers' quarters. Basically, my job was to learn as much as I could while keeping out of everyone's way. My first war patrol, so the Kriegstagebuch or war diary of U-375 reminds me, began late in the afternoon of April the 28th of 1942, when we left La Spezia bound for the western Mediterranean. As soon as we had emerged from the harbor, Kapitänleutnant Könenkamp carried out drills intended to test the crew's reaction to an Alarmtauchen or crash dive. Almost immediately we began to have trouble with the starboard diesel, which took us 4 hours to fix, but after that problem was solved, we continued on the surface west across the Gulf of Genoa. On April the 29th, the CO held another alarm drill, and late in the evening of that day he received a radio message from U-Boat High Command Italy, ordering U-375 to patrol the south half of grid square CH-75, which was about midway between Spain and North Africa, 60 to 70 miles south of the Spanish city of Almeria. When this message reached us, we were already west of the island of Sardinia, as we had made good time running on the surface. Our luck, however, did not hold. On the morning of the following day, April the 30th, 1942, enemy aircraft forced U-375 to crash dive twice. A few minutes later, the starboard diesel failed again. At almost the same time, we received a message from U-Boat High Command Italy that our agents had reported that a British aircraft carrier, cruiser and 5 destroyers had left Gibraltar at 6 AM that morning, and Kapitänleutnant Könenkamp therefore altered course, hoping to be able to intercept this enemy force early the next day. During the evening and night of April the 30th, we passed south of Mallorca, but our troublesome starboard diesel reduced our surface speed, and in the late afternoon of May the 1st, it failed completely. Within half an hour, we altered course a second time after receiving an order from High Command to go to the assistance of U-573, which had been caught by British aircraft on the surface just off the Spanish coast and had been so badly damaged that it could not submerge. Our CO estimated that, given the reported position of U-573 and our current surface speed, which had been reduced to about 12 knots rather than the normal 17 by the malfunctioning starboard diesel, it would take us nearly 5 hours before we could reach the beleaguered U-573. We proceeded at our best speed, but at about 8 PM in the evening of May the 1st, we were forced to crash dive twice by a Sunderland flying boat which, in the event, did not attack. Shortly before midnight we reached the reported position of U-573, but there was nothing to see, and by radio our CO requested clarification of the damaged boat's position from High Command. We then altered course for the Spanish coast near Alicante, and while on passage received a warning from High Command that we could expect to encounter numerous British aircraft in the coming daylight hours. Shortly before dawn, we received a second message calling off our rescue mission, as German and Italian aircraft and Spanish warships were expected to reach and assist U-573 that day. The warning about enemy air activity turned out to be entirely accurate. In the late morning of May the 2nd, British aircraft forced us to crash dive twice, and this day turned out to be a very difficult one for U-375. We were now under orders to patrol in the north half of grid square CH-81 or the Spanish coast of Cartagena, which was fortunate for us as we happened to be near that area. At almost the same time, the clutch between the port diesel and port electric motor began to malfunction, making it very difficult for us to recharge our batteries. As if this were not bad enough, just after 2 PM we were spotted by a British flying boat, but managed to dive before it dropped 2 bombs, which missed us by a considerable distance. The CO observed the movements of this aircraft, a Catalina, through the periscope, and although it flew away, it was shortly replaced by 2 more aircraft of the same type, which carried out an attack that resulted in between 10 and 20 bombs being dropped. It was hard to make an exact count in our vicinity. Kapitänleutnant Könenkamp now began a submerged run to the south to seek deeper water. As our starboard diesel had failed completely by now, Könenkamp wisely decided that his best course of action was to abort the patrol and return to La Spezia because U-375 was clearly in no condition to continue. We therefore altered course to the east and, as soon as darkness had fallen, surfaced. At 10:20 p.m. however, an enemy destroyer appeared directly ahead and, although Könenkamp tried to outmaneuver him on the surface, the enemy spotted our wake and altered course towards us. We crash dived and went down to a depth of 60 meters, but the depth charges soon began to fall, and although none came closer than 150 yards, the enemy kept up at the attack for nearly 2 hours. Könenkamp recorded in the KTB that in all 13 depth charges came our way, but we suffered only minor damage. The enemy destroyer abandoned the hunt at midnight, and when the CO was sure he had gone, we surfaced. It was now May the 3rd, and as we had received permission from U-Boat High Command Italy to return to base, we made course for La Spezia, running on the surface as much as possible. It still took us 3 days to get home, but finally at 8 AM on May the 6th, 1942, we made fast at a berth in the U-boat base. My first war patrol, which had lasted only 8 days, was now over. As soon as I returned, I learned some bad news. My friend Otto Luft's boat, U-74, was overdue from its scheduled return. Later, we heard that it had been sunk and that there were no survivors. I was devastated by this news, as this was the first time during the war that I lost a close friend. Sometime later, I received a large parcel from his father, who operated a photo laboratory. The package contained good prints of the pictures that Otto had taken that recorded our time at the Marineschule and in Italy up to the day he departed on his ill-fated patrol. His father, knowing I was Otto's friend, thought I might like to have these prints as a keepsake, and thanks to his generosity, I am today able to illustrate my naval career from Flensburg to La Spezia. It was clear to everyone that U-375 needed major repairs to its diesel and electric motors, but we shortly discovered that the boat had even worse problems. When we attempted to draw the torpedoes from the forward tubes, we found that the tubes had become so warped that the pistons which pushed the torpedoes out of them could no longer move. A defect of this nature could not be fixed, all 4 tubes would have to be replaced, and the boat would therefore be out of action for months. As was customary, while this work was in progress, the crew was sent to a hotel maintained by the Kriegsmarine in Viareggio, one of the most popular resorts in the Gulf of Genoa. For 2 weeks we lay on the beach, drank ourselves through numerous bars, went sightseeing to places like Florence and Pisa, and attended a performance at the Opera House in Lucca, with our officers being officially honored by seats in the royal box. I also enjoyed the hospitality of an Italian business tycoon who invited me to spend a weekend with him and his family at his estate on beautiful Lake Como near Milan. During my time in Italy, it was noticeable to me and my comrades that there were almost no indications that this nation was at war. In the 3 months I was posted to La Spezia, I never saw an Italian warship enter or leave the base, while at the ritual evening promenade in Viareggio, young men of military age strolled up and down, a dozen abreast and arm in arm, seemingly without a care in the world. After a few weeks at Viareggio, I returned to La Spezia, and the remainder of my time in Italy was spent in trying to assist in the repairs of U-375. A better knowledge of Italian would have been helpful, but by now I had become only too familiar with domani and dopodomani, which in most cases were the stock replies to almost every question asked about progress. I was not there when the boat was finally ready because after a few more glorious weeks of sunshine, Chianti and ice cream on the shores of the Mediterranean, it was time to return to the Marineschule at Kiel for more specialized technical classes. The train trip north, which I made with a Fähnrich zur See, was interrupted by a sightseeing visit to Parma. After we had recrossed the Alps, the soft pastel colors of the landscape and the overcast weather were almost a welcome relief from the eternally blue sky, the aquamarine Mediterranean, and the strong reds and greens that dominate the scenery of Italy. U-375 continued to serve in the Mediterranean until July 30th, 1943, when, still under Könenkamp's command, it was sunk with all hands near Pantellaria.
Benvenuti nei diari di trincea, questo è il rapporto dopo l'azione e sono il tuo ospite, Jay. Well, I must confess, after finishing the other books and reading about the realities of being a BOW, our man being stationed in Italy seems a bit like a fever dream. And as you may have noticed, I too have picked up a few words of Italian here and there, not just because the language is beautiful, but so is the country, and I, of course, have been many times. In fact, Italy is the most popular vacation destination for Germans. Actually, my very first trip abroad after the Soviet Union collapsed and we were allowed to visit the evil capitalist pigs was to Italy, so the country carries a very special place in my heart. As for Werner, we have learned about how he came to know the Italian work ethic as well as the intricacies of the Type 7 boat. He also talked about the lack of communication between the services and some friendly fire incidents. Interestingly, he mentions a German boat being rammed and sunk by an Italian destroyer, which is a boat that veteran members of the channel know pretty well. It was U-557, the boat that Herbert, the author of Iron Coffin, served on, and which was rammed by the Orione. There were no survivors in this incident. Same goes for the best friend of our current author, who did not return from his very first patrol. The realities of war caught up to him really quick. Anyway, that is it for this episode. I will see you next week. Thank you for watching, consider subscribing and liking. Cheers and bye bye.